Good evening to all of you, and thank you for coming. My name is Alex Quitzels. I'm the Dean of Visual Arts and Media Studies, and I have a little bit to do with what's going on from October 10th to October 31st, which is the Skin Festival, part of the city of Pasadena, and we're kind of connected to what we're trying citywide and college-wide. There are a number of events that remain in between now and the 31st. There is a program that has been already published and posted. There is something on the website, on the college webpage. So if you were to find a little bit more about it, I will suggest that you may want to check there. And tonight, I'm looking at the subject, and as a painter, I find that a very interesting question. What color is black? I thought, black is not color, but somehow we're going to find out a little bit more about it today. It's my pleasure to introduce to you my friend and colleague and the Dean of Languages, Dr. Ted Young, who's going to be doing the conversation with you tonight. And I understand that he wants it to turn into a conversation to some extent, because I'm sure that there will be a lot of things that will linger for a while, and maybe you would like to come back and ask here and there something that was not either clear or entirely complete. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ted.
Thank you. Somebody just asked if I am Theodore R. Young, PhD, and I am. Give you a little idea of who I am and why I'm here. I am the Dean of the Languages Division here at Pasadena City College. I'm also a visiting professor of Brazilian literature and Brazilian culture at UCLA. Before I came here, I was a professor of Latin American Studies at Florida International University. Before that, I was a professor at UCLA, and before that, I did my PhD in Harvard in Romance Languages and Literatures. My connection with Brazil goes back to 1976. I lived in Brazil starting in 1977 and have spent a very significant amount of my adult life in Brazil, both on a personal level and a professional academic level. So those are kind of my credentials for why I'm talking about a subject like this, which is a question of race, which is a complicated question. I'm going to start out with some basic history of Brazil. I have to assume that most of you have not studied the history of Brazil in detail. If you have, bear with me. The Portuguese first arrived in Brazil in 1500. There are a lot of debates as to whether or not they knew that the country existed, a landmass existed before they got there. They initially thought it was a large island. Later on, they figured out that it was a continental landmass, and the name of the island changed after that. From 1500 to 1600, the Portuguese primarily sent degredados, soldados, e padres. They sent priests, soldiers, and these exiled people whose prison term consisted in being sent to one of the foreign lands abroad, where they were dispendable. They were the people who, on first contact, you meet some other people and you don't know, are they going to kill me or are they going to be nice? You, go talk to them. Those are the degredados, all male. So for about a century, the Portuguese only sent males to Brazil. They had the degredados, soldiers for obvious reasons, and they had priests, very few, but enough to do the very important things, which were primarily last rites for all the people who were dying from their overseas expansion. What led the Portuguese to Brazil was their quest to reach the Indies, their quest to round the Cape of Africa to get to India and to get to the Far East and get spices and silks and things like that and bring them back and make a lot of money. Because of the prevailing currents around the African coast, the West African coast, once they got around the part of Africa that bulges out, they couldn't follow the coastline the way they wanted to and still make it around. So they had to go farther out because the currents spin in a counterclockwise motion. And they went farther and farther out and eventually bumped into this place now called Brazil. During this period of time, with primarily European males, Portuguese males, in what is now Brazil, there was a lot of miscegenation. There was a lot of sex between the men and the women, the Portuguese men and the indigenous women. The first known shipment of slaves from Africa came in 1538. When the Portuguese got to Brazil, they had already been working their way down the coast of Africa, and they had been enslaving people already. The reason, the justification for enslaving people was because the people of Africa were infidels, which is different than pagan. Infidel means the unfaithful, those who have turned their backs on the quote-unquote one true faith. I could go back centuries in terms of the history of the Iberian Peninsula, but in essence, the Islamic peoples who were in North Africa invaded the Iberian Peninsula, and then centuries later, people invoked the names of those rulers from centuries ago to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula. The Portuguese, when they got down to the end of what is now Portugal, the old Roman Lusitania Romana, jumped over into the North African coast in 1516 to Ceuta and continued the reconquest to wrench the land from the infidels. Why infidel? Because Islamic people are people who came after Christianity, therefore they're people who turned their backs on Christianity, therefore they've sold their soul to the devil essentially, and they are eligible for slavery.
So the Islamists were being enslaved?
Those were the people who could be enslaved. That was the initial rationale. As they worked their way down the African coast, they clearly came across different people, but they still had papal approval to enslave these people, and they continued the process. By the time they're into the region of the Congo in sub-Saharan Africa, they know, and there are documents that show that they know that they're not dealing with the Islamic North African people that were the enemy and the infidel, but it was becoming a lucrative business, and later it would prove to be a lot more lucrative. In 1538, they brought the first shipment over because when they arrived in Brazil, the very first moment of arrival, the moment of first contact, was a vision of Eden. If you read the scribe who was on Cabral's journey when he arrived there, they thought this must be Eden before the fall. Everybody was naked, and nobody was ashamed of it. And the European sailors didn't know what to make of that. They went pretty crazy about it. But they couldn't comprehend why these people would have no shame about their shame. Shame was a term that was used for people's private parts, and so that's shame, but they have no shame, so they're all shameless, but in a good sense. They left a few degredados there, and Cabral's voyage in 1500 continued on to get to the Indies so they could make a lot of money. And they told the people they left behind, you become fluent in the language and customs of this region, and we'll pick you up sometime on the way back in a year or two or so, and then you can be our interpreters. When they came back a long time later, they couldn't find them initially, and the people that they did find, some had been eaten because cannibalism was practiced, and that's a different lecture that we don't have time for tonight. And some of them had gone native. On the one hand, they were told that they're supposed to wear heavy woolen clothing in the tropics, work really hard, abstain from pleasures, and do everything they can to satisfy a society that had sent them off to this kind of living purgatory, or they could live like the Tupi-Guarani peoples, where they had a lot of leisure time, a concept that didn't exist for working classes in Europe at the time. They collected fruit and berries and things from the forest, and they had multiple wives, and they could enjoy their lives. And so a couple of them said, you know, this is nice, I'm going to stay here, and I'm not going back to Portugal, no way. And that was the beginning of this mixing. This is important because it is the real foundation and also the kind of mythical foundation of racial notions in Brazil and things that would happen then over the next few centuries. 1697, I have up there, Palmares Quilombo was destroyed. Quilombos were these communities set up by escaped slaves. And by 1697, there, in a region of northeastern Brazil, enough slaves had escaped that they formed a de facto African community in the backlands of Brazil. It represented such a threat to mainstream Brazilian society, or the Portuguese society in Brazil at the time, that they amassed enough of an army to go out and absolutely destroy the place. Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery. That's a photocopy of the document of abolition, the final abolition. They did it in several parts. In 1850, initially they abolished the transatlantic traffic of slaves. Then in 1871, they passed what's called the Free Womb Law. The idea of that law is that a woman's womb is free, and so even if the woman is enslaved, a child born to her is born into freedom. Sounds very noble, sounds very nice, as does the next law that they passed, which is the sexagenarian law, 1885, that said that anybody who was a slave who lived to be 60 years old was granted freedom. Well, that's nice too. You know, poor old guy worked really hard, okay, we'll let him go free. If you think about it from a business point of view, if I'm a slave owner and you're all my slaves, okay, you have a child. That child's an infant. That child can't work for me. But I have to support that child if that child's my slave. I have to do things to take care of the child. If after 1871 that child is free, I don't have to worry about the kid. You have to take care of the kid. If after 1885 you live to be 60 years old, and mind you, very few people live that long under conditions of slavery, but if you happen to survive that long, there's not a lot of work you can do for me anymore. And remember, life expectancy among the privileged classes at that time was less than 60. You know, a white male at that time probably would not live to be 60, so the chances that somebody who had lived through slavery for their entire lives, reaching 60 years old, were minimal. But if you happen to get there, there's no way you're going to be working in the fields for me anymore. But I can be noble and say, I now grant you your freedom. Which means I don't have to care for you, I don't have to feed you, I don't have to take care of your medical condition, I don't have to do anything for you. You're 60, thank you, get off my property. A very noble law. The final law, 1888, the Golden Law, a Lei Aurea, which is what that document is at the left, signed by Princess Isabel, granted manumission to all the slaves in Brazil. If I say it fast enough, I can cover this part too. The forces that led the abolition movement in Brazil had different purposes in mind. There were people who really believed that slavery is an evil and dirty institution and it's morally wrong and we should not enslave, people should not enslave other people. They were a minority. You had people who, for political purposes, supported abolition because it was tied to the movement, the Republican movement, to get rid of the monarchy and to create a Republican form of government where you have elected officials and you have a president and things like that. That was very strong. That was a majority of them. There was also an undercurrent of racism. The racism came from people who believed that the presence of blacks in Brazilian society undermined society because blacks are inferior people, and so having them here among us brings us down to a lower level. So if we can get rid of everybody, we have abolition and then get rid of these people, perhaps send them back to Africa, perhaps let them die off. But then we're going to improve our society. When we look at census data over a span of years, we see some interesting details. Plenty of seats in the front. You'll notice that in 1835, the vast majority were considered black. Then we see this change, 1872, 1890, then jumping up to 1940, 50, 60, 80 over these years, we see a predominance of white. At the same time, we see a steady growth of brown. The question of what color are you is the question that shows up in so-called hard data like this. In 1835, that's well before the end of slavery, the data was grounded on who was a slave or the immediate direct descendant of a slave and who was not. And that's that very tall line, over 50% of the population being black. White is actually kind of surprising, being over 20, it's about 25%, because the people who were who were entirely of European descent would be even less than that. It was a small minority that controlled a huge majority. After the census of 1980, the 1990 census, you see that this trend kind of continues, with a majority being white, a very large amount being brown, tiny little fraction, less than 5% considered black, and then you have the categories of Indian, Asian, and others like that are barely a blip on the screen. So, the question for the census, and the question that comes to bear in what we're talking about, is what color are you? What defines color? In 1976, the Brazilian census decided to, instead of having these categories of black, brown, white, they would ask people, what color are they? And they went door to door, and instead of having the census taker come up and look at you and say, you look pretty white, and you look kind of brown, and yeah, you're black, and I'm not sure what you are, and you're... They asked people, what are you? They got 135 responses. 135 self-identifications of different races of what they are. Some of them are very interesting. It's also interesting to note that some of them are pejorative when used by other people. In other words, individuals would self-identify in terms that would be considered pejorative if somebody else called them that. There are some very obvious things. Morena is a traditional term, just like mulat is a traditional term. These are all in the feminine because for those of you studying Portuguese, raça is a feminine noun, and so qual é a sua raça? Minha raça é morena, minha raça é mulata, minha raça é negra. It has to agree grammatically. Queimada, burnt. Rosa queimada, kind of a burnt rose color. Yeah. Here's the list as a one shot. 133, greenish. And there's red, and there's pink, and there's black, 112. And there's pouco morena, kind of morena. Morena is something a little bit, it's lighter than pardo, which is darker than mulato, but it's in between, but we're kind of that. We've got things that refer specifically to skin color. References to café con leite, coffee with milk. References to, bugrezinha escura is a great one. A bugre is a fairly pejorative term for somebody who has indigenous background, usually still lives out in no meio do mato, out in the middle of the boonies. And so you can be kind of a dark version of this kind of Indian-like mix, and that's who you are. This is from the 1976 census. It was published by Robert Levine. I think it came out in the book Brazilian Legacies. You can find it in different sources. I've got this, I cut and pasted out of an email that came from Levine, actually, when he was trying to come up with good translations for all the different terms before he published it in his book. So this is actually out of an email that I got. But you'll see references to 14, avermelhada, reddish but with blood vessels showing through the skin. And then some of them, agalegada, an often derogatory term for a Galician, somebody from Galicia in northeastern Iberia, with features considered gross and misshapen. That's a term. There are references to hair texture, hair color, whether or not you have freckles, your overall visage. And these are the different ways that people saw themselves. These are the different ways in which people self-identified. Part of the reason I like to use this list is because I like to contrast it with the basic notion in the United States of you are black, you are white, you are maybe Hispanic, which is ethnicity, race, what is that? You could be Asian, you could be this, you could be that. We have very limited categories, and everybody's expected to fit into one of them. Paradigms in race are very different. Back in the day, so to speak, the idea of positivism was this idea of inferior and superior races. There's a very good book on it by David Haberle called The Three Sad Races that he published in 1983. David Haberle doesn't espouse these ideas, but he explains the thinking. The positivists had this scale. It was designed by primarily Northern Europeans, so Northern Europeans are the most superior of races, coincidental. They saw Europe itself as this continuum, because obviously Southern Europe was darker and inferior. Those people aren't as serious, they don't work as hard as we do. You know, they're not as productive as we are. They take siestas in the afternoons, come on. They're inferior to us. And if you go darker, you get Africans. Africans are practically animals. They don't even rate on this scale. The Portuguese are European, but they're from the extreme southwest of Europe. And they're the result of mixing of Latin blood with Visigoth blood, with a lot of North African blood. And then these Portuguese, who are the inferior race among the superior Europeans, go off to Brazil. What do they do in Brazil? They mix with indigenous blood, much darker, and African blood, the lowest of the low. So they are the result of three sad races. This was a mindset among the positivists. When you look at abolition, what I was talking about before, and the racism that was behind some of abolition, these were people who believed in this notion of inferior races and what it would do to society to have it mix. Their program that they brought about was to import European, Northern European preferably, peasant stock to take the place of the African labor that at that point was becoming, on its way to become former slaves. They started out in the beginning of the 19th century bringing in Germans. That's what they wanted. Aryans, blonde hair, blue eyes, superior, just like Hitler thought we're going to take over the world. Brought in Germans for a while. The problem is when Germans were brought in and those who had to work in the conditions such as the coffee plantations around Sao Paulo, they didn't like being treated like slaves. They were not slaves. They didn't want to be treated that way. But the landowners still viewed them, labor is equal to slave, and so they treated them the same way. Eventually, there were prohibitions placed by German governments on who could come over and how they would come over. In southern Brazil, it was a little bit different because colonies were brought over, and to this day they're called colonias, where a community from someplace in Germany would be brought over and they would establish a community in Brazil, a whole tract of land, and people were given so many acres and a plow and a horse and this and that, and it was all set up. And when they got everything they were promised, they actually prospered fairly well. But there's a whole different evolution, and to this day in southern Brazil you can see a different racial and ethnic composition than you would see in other parts of Brazil. Up around the coffee areas, Sao Paulo, Rio, Minas Gerais, the Germans stopped coming in. So who are they going to bring in? Well, Italy was going through an economic crisis, and there were a lot of Italian peasants, and we can bring them in, they can work. So they started bringing in the Italians. Italians started coming in around 1872, and they brought them in for several decades, to the extent that the Portuguese spoken in Sao Paulo has strong Italian influences in the cadence and the way it's spoken. They also went to southern Brazil and into some other regions as well. After the Italian wave started to fade away, so to speak, because conditions improved in Italy, at the turn of the 20th century, in 1902, they needed other people, and so they started to bring in Japanese. specifically to Sao Paulo, specifically for the coffee plantations. It was a long process to get Japanese accepted, because initially the people thinking like positivists said, well, Japanese, that's not white, that's yellow, that's inferior. So the Japanese government, among others, started a campaign to convince people that, no, a few years ago on TV there was a campaign about eating pork, the other white meat. Do you remember that? A couple people might. That was a kind of campaign. Japanese, the other white people. We're not like Chinese. We're not like Koreans. We're definitely not like Africans. We are Japanese. We are white Asians. And that sold. So then Japanese came in. They suffered many of the similar kinds of problems that the Germans faced and the Italians faced in terms of being treated like slaves. Difference being within basically one generation after the people who arrived, they were getting off the coffee plantations, and within 2 generations they were into vegetable farming, and within 3 generations they became their own bosses for the most part and started producing other things. So there was a change there. Another major change is that for the most part Japanese did not mix with the general Brazilian population the way the Africans had, the way the Italians eventually did. The Germans didn't so much, but to a lesser extent, and the Portuguese very much did. In the 1930s, Gilberto Freire came up with a notion of racial democracy. His thesis was that with all the mixing that's gone on in Brazil, there is no racism, because everybody is a little bit of everything else. And so we live in democracy. And he compared that to kinds of things that went on, for example, in the United States, where there was a complete separation along racial lines. And this became the reigning paradigm for decades. To this day, there are people who believe that we don't have racism in Brazil. We have racial democracy, because everybody has a little bit of something. Not the current president, but the previous president, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, once in a public speech said that eu tenho pé na senzala. I have a foot in the slave quarters. It's like I have a taint of the tar brush. I've got some slave blood in me as well. And he said it with pride. He probably doesn't, but he said it with pride. And it was well accepted, too, because it's part of what is becoming this vision, what became in the decades after 1930, that yes, we all have a little bit of that. If you were to go back to the end of the 19th century, when Romanticism was around, everybody accepted the fact that we all are indigenous to some extent. We all are the noble savage, civilized and Europeanized. After 1930, we all have something African about us. And that became part of the vision. Now, I'm a little bit sarcastic as I'm saying this, but it's important to understand that that is part of the collective mentality that exists in Brazil. And it's also important to understand that particular cultural traits can be divorced from actual origins of family members. Coming out of this, looking at it with a critical eye, people like Degler came up with the notion of the mulatto escape hatch. And in fact, Degler has, in the book Neither Black Nor White, he has one anecdote that, for me, really explains the difference between race relations in Brazil and race relations in the US. He's looking at it contrastively. He's in a restaurant, and he's noticing the people who are coming in and who's allowed to come into the nice restaurant and who is excluded. He's comparing it to a restaurant in the United States during segregation. During segregation, if you look black, you don't come in. You look white, you can come in terms of skin color and basic appearances. Skin, hair, nose, lips, things like that. You? Okay. You? No. He's in this restaurant in Brazil, and people are coming in, and you have some people who are very obviously white, and they get to come in. And people who are very obviously black, and they don't get to come in. But you have people who are a little bit lighter, or a little bit darker, or a mix, and depending on their overall appearances, they may or may not be admitted. An offshoot of that is the idea developed by Florestan Fernandes and some other Marxists who were at the University of São Paulo at the time, and later developed more by Roger Bastide and Claude Lévi-Strauss and other people, including Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the later to be president of Brazil, of economic racism. And what they're saying is that you can't look at race relations in Brazil just in terms of skin color or basic appearances. What you have to look at is overall societal position. At the extreme, somebody who is very white, blonde hair, blue eyes, very white skin, is white. And somebody who's very black is black. But for the majority of the population, it also corresponds to your economic status. So you could be darker but wealthier and become whiter. You can be whiter but poorer and you become darker. So if you're moreno, not as dark as mulatto, not as dark as negro, but moreno, but you're poor and you're living in the favela, in the shanties, then you're black. You can be pardo, you can be mulatto, but you have more money, and so that makes you whiter. There was a reaction to this starting in the late 1960s, the idea, taking ideas from the US of black power, the different empowering movements that happened in the United States. Robert Levine, the one who came up with that list, for the most part espoused that. Carol Boyce Davies, Robin Sheriff, other people who espouse that. The latter two are people who are working on issues of race in Brazil right now. They tend to be people who either are from the United States or are trained in the United States, and their argument is that everything does come down to a question of being black or white. And all these other things are ways to hide it, to pass, to pretend that something doesn't exist. There was a very strong reaction to them by Pierre Bourdieu, who referred to that as cultural imperialism. He said, you can't take a North American paradigm for race, something that developed through history and culture of the United States, and impose that on a different culture that has a different history and say, that has to be the paradigm because we think that way, so you have to think that way. And for the most part, the people who are part of the descendants of the Black Power movement are people who either are from the United States and have parachuted into Brazil, or they're people who have trained in the United States and then taken that training and looked at the question of Brazil and have seen the ways in which people pass or the way in which people hide their identity. They'll look at that previous list, which is one of the things that Levine did, and say, what, canela, cinnamon, that's a nice way to avoid saying black. Part of the complexity is that sometimes that is a nice way to avoid saying black. Personally, I've been in situations where people are in a room and they want to refer to somebody and they'll say, aquele moreno, that you know, kind of slightly brown guy over there. And I'll look and you talking about Eve? You mean the black guy? And they'll say, oh, well, because it's not polite to call somebody black. So this does go on. People use other terms sometimes to avoid saying the dirty words like black. That does happen. But if you go back to the list of 135 different definitions, self-describers, it shows that people have different perceptions. And part of those perceptions acknowledge things beyond the simple appearances of what's your skin color or what kind of hair do you have. So we come down to an issue of what is race. These are all black faces, right? Somebody's shaking her head. Well, aren't they? Pardon me?
Yeah, most of them.
They're black?
Their features.
They all look alike. They all have the same skin color, they have the same eyes, the same nose, the same mouth, the same hair. They're all the same, right? This is black.
Yeah, it's similar noses, but not the same. The first one and the third one are different.
They're all different.
Okay, so skin color decides black. So these people are all black, right? Because they all have the same skin color. Shades of black. Shades. So it's kind of like the old linguistic theory. What was his name? Worf, who came up with it about the Eskimos and different words for snow, and they have hundreds of different words for snow because they see it as different kinds of things, and because they have lexicon for that, they have a different perception of it. It's kind of the idea that that is red and that is red, but you know what? That's not the same red. That this is black, and this is black, and this is black, but you know what? It's not the same black. In the United States, we'd look at these people and say they're all black. In Brazil, you look at these people and you would say, well, yeah, he's black, but he's white, and he might be, depending on his social class, mulato, moreno, something like that. Definitely moreno claro. He's not black. They're all different appearances. So we can't just say skin color. Are we going to say, okay, nose, hair, lips, things like that? Does that determine somebody's race? So these people are all black? Eve is laughing. These are those faces. Are they all the same? So the question really is, what is a criteria that we're going to use to determine whether or not they are black? My position is that the notion of race is a cultural construct. Each culture constructs its own vision of what that is. In the United States, we live in a society that is not homogeneous. In Brazil, it's a society that's very mixed. And the ways in which people have determined what is race is not based on science. Brazil doesn't have that same legacy. Brazil has a different legacy, equally racist, but different. I like these faces. So what is it that makes you white, black, Asian, Hispanic, Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid? The original 3 races. What are the determining factors? Now you'll notice I have things up here like Hispanic or Asian or Native American or Indo-European. How many of you have ever filled out a form where you have to mark down what race you are? Other. Other. Okay. What do you do if you're Tiger Woods? You have to choose one and only one, and you have to identify as being that race. Why? Why is it that if your mother is a white English woman and your father is what in Brazil would be called a mulatto from Philadelphia, that makes you black? Why? Because this society will say that you are. In Brazil, perhaps not. That's all the same woman in those pictures, by the way. Probably noticed that. Although one is Nordic and one is kind of Asian and one is kind of black and one is it's all the same woman. Thanks to Photoshop, minor changes, and you start to get different impressions and realize very minor differences in somebody's physical appearance will change the way you react to them. And moreover, the way you react isn't necessarily the same way that people will react from other cultures. So is your race determined by your lineage, your family, your background, where you come from? Biracial family or a multiracial family. Black man, white woman, 2 kids. Are the kids black? Are the kids white? Are they other? What box do they mark? What box would you mark for them if you're the census taker and you do like they do in Brazil now? After the 135 categories they couldn't deal with, now you walk up and the census taker looks at you and says, black. Canela is not an option anymore. Yeah. So I close, and now we can talk about things, with a picture, the epitome of Brazil, soccer. This is the team that was the pentacampeão. Of course, we all know the great importance of that. And you'll notice that everybody who plays for Brazil is black, or white, or mulatto, or something like that. And it's up to you to decide, it's up for them to decide, it's up to a society to decide. You shouldn't be locked into particular definitions. Closing anecdote. I had a girlfriend from Rio. Her father was a white American from Pennsylvania. Her mother was a white Brazilian from Rio whose family is from the Northeast. And her mother's grandfathers was black enough that they cut him out of family pictures. I've seen the pictures cut like that. My ex-girlfriend's mother, when she was young, was black enough that the family sent her off to an orphanage because they were embarrassed to have her in the family. She whitened herself enough that the family accepted her back. This girlfriend that I had was white in Brazil. Her family's very wealthy. Members of the most elite country club in Rio. She went to school in New York. She's black. And she didn't know it. Because the United States has a different paradigm than Brazil. It's a different awareness. So I leave you with this idea that race is not an absolute. Race is not something that is genetic. Race is something that we as a society decide it is. And so we as a society can be racist or not. We can notice a commonality of all people, or we can choose to discriminate based on any number of superficial aspects that can't be checked in the blood. Thank you. Questions, discussion. You were fairly quiet. Yes?
What would your conclusion be on the current status of Brazil right now?
Current status of Brazil, it's a very racist country.
Well, okay, before you even start that, when I look at the other surrounding countries in South America, I think of those countries as racist.
They are.
And so, looking inwards towards Brazil, Brazil actually looks like a very open society. And so,
The racism in Brazil is more subtle than other countries. That was kind of the thing that Degler was noticing in 1971. Actually, his studies were in the late 60s. They never had an apartheid kind of system where I look at you and you sit in the back of the bus and you come here. But there are many different ways in which the racism can manifest itself. And the huge reaction against the notion of racial democracy that we see right now are the people who see that as an easy way to to gloss over all of the deep problems that come out from racism. So it is there and it needs to be acknowledged. I personally think that Florestan Fernandes' ideas of economic racism are fairly sound. I've seen that personally many times where, well, the ex-girlfriend of mine, you know, you look at her, it's clear that she has African blood. There was no question about it, but very little, and she's rich, so she's white. You know, and you can see that all the time. So clubs, there's an anecdote, and I have to admit, I don't know if it's real, but have you ever heard of Pelé?
Yes.
The greatest soccer player of all times, I do have to say that. He belonged to a social club in Santos, the city where he lived for years and the team he played for, a club that did not admit blacks until, I think, 1980 or something like that. They did not admit blacks, but he was a member of the club. He's the most famous Brazilian of all times, one of the richest people in the country, so he got to go to the club.
So instead of it being a racist society, it's more like an economically
It's classist and racist because you've got two floating scales.
So in the United States, when slavery was, large, the they would give out certificates. If you had enough money, you can buy a white certificate, and you can be like, okay, I'm white.
You could pass,
Uh-huh.
right?
So did they have anything like that in Brazil? Any, like,
Not explicitly, not explicitly like that. Abolition, I covered it very briefly, but it was a complex process. It had many different stages to it. And people never stopped acknowledging that somebody might have some African blood, but it wasn't a matter of either or, so you have to pass for something else. It was a more gradual, there's a continuum of notions of race. And so you don't have to be, here's the dividing line, you're that side, you're this side. Yeah.
Actually, it's really interesting, to see you comment the positivism theory, just on the heel of what Dr. Watson had to say about, Jean and Africans. But when you look at what Bourdieu said about cultural imperialism, I don't know how you feel about it, but it seems to me like, third world countries or other societies tend to refrain from adopting what works in the so-called first world country. So this applies to democracy, for example. We say, well, we have our own specificity, therefore, we cannot adopt this. We have to go at our own pace. So this seems a classical, cop-out in that fashion.
There's one problem, and it's common, of the reaction you're saying. No, we've got our own way of doing things. We don't want this interference. I think that's also offset by this idea of the cultural imperialism that, well, we're more educated, we know better, so this is what you must think. And Bourdieu got tons of negative reaction to what he said, referring to that as a form of imperialism. But in my professional life, I've seen Robin Sheriff and Carol Boyce Davies were colleagues of mine at one point. We disagreed about everything. Good friends, but we disagreed. Robin Sheriff spent a summer in Brazil. She spent a couple months in Brazil, a couple years later came back. She spent this time, but she knew what to look for because she had been educated here, came in with these notions, and found a way to make these ideas of race fit into the society that she saw. It's happened with economic theory all over Latin America. The Chicago boys, as they were called, the people who study economics in Chicago, and then they're going to fix the problems of Latin America because they know economic theory, and they can parachute in, that was a term that used to be used, to any place in the world, Africa, Asia, Latin America, and fix it because they know economic theory. But I think that over the decades, we've seen that any kind of theory, if it's divorced from the cultural and historical legacies of a particular region, don't work. And I think that applies to notions of race and notions of politics and economics and everything else. Personal opinion. Yes?
I noticed that you said that race is not in the blood, but you keep saying race is in the blood. I feel like you're saying African. Does the person have African blood in them? So what would you say is the third term?
You can talk about remote or even immediate origins, geographic origins of somebody, and you can look at different predominant features from a particular region. And we usually refer to that as the blood of somebody. When I talked about drawing blood from somebody, I was thinking in scientific terms. If you take the blood, you do a blood test, you can do DNA analysis. There are different things you can test for. You can see if somebody's diabetic or not. You can see things like that. But you're not going to draw the blood and see, oh, this person has dark skin and dark curly hair and a broad nose and thin lips. Or this person has blonde hair and blue eyes and is 6'4", and that's not something that you're going to see in a blood test. So there are genetic traits that tend to focus in particular geographic regions, or tended to focus more, because increasingly, with every year that goes by, there's less isolationism going on in the world. I mean, if you were to go to Norway right now, you probably wouldn't find too many people who look like Brazilians. But most countries within, I'll limit it to the Western Hemisphere, to the New World, have undergone a lot of mixing of people from different origins. I mean, there are ways to trace people back. I mean, I put up there Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid. You can trace different things back to large groups for origins. You can do that linguistically. You can languages that people speak, going into large groups of languages. But that doesn't determine who you are here now. That might determine where a particular lineage comes from. But I look at you, I can't tell you who you are, where you come from. I could guess, and I could be wrong.
Were you saying what terminology you would use? Like instead of saying you have Brazilian blood, what other, like what verbiage would you use? That would
Depends on what you're trying to say. If you're trying to talk about the origins of your family, where they come from, then you can talk about that. But even that's complicated. I mean, here we talk about, you're Hispanic. What does that mean? Well, it comes from Hispania, the Latin word for a region of the Iberian Peninsula. But does that mean, most of the time when people say Hispanic in Southern California, you're talking about somebody who is, well, they're Mexican, generic Mexican. Mexican could include Guatemalan, but it's thinking like Mexican in general. Well,
politically correct term would be what, Latin?
is it? Latin comes from the idea of Latin America, which was developed by the French to justify their invasion of Mexico, because they're saying we're all Latins actually, so it's actually a reunification. So politically correct, that becomes difficult because you don't want to be offensive, but a lot of times we can get caught up in political correctness and we end up becoming less precise or afraid to say realities. Like the people I know who would say, Kelly Moreno ali, because they're afraid to say he's black. What's wrong with saying somebody's black? What's wrong with saying that they're white? What's wrong? I mean, what is Hispanic? Hispanic is what, an ethnicity? It's a mixture of Iberian blood, which is in itself a mixture of Latin, of Visigoth, of North African, plus then indigenous peoples.
It's people's way to simplify thought. It's easy, black or white. So you don't get into, you don't see a Hispanic person and you don't say, oh, that person's brown. You don't. You say, oh, they're Hispanic or Mexican or whatever. Then you get more into detail about other races, about Asians. You don't call Asians yellow. It's
not
rare.
anymore.
Yeah. Some people
But
do.
white is white and black is black, but yellow's not yellow and brown's not brown?
Yes.
And why?
Exactly.
Because it's not politically correct. Now, there's one thing to try to be specific. There's something else to have prejudice attached to that. And that's kind of the point I'm talking about. I don't mind saying, okay, she's blonde and you're brunette. You've got dark hair, she's got light hair. And if I need to point you out and I'm in a room and I'm telling this person, go and talk to, I can't say the word blonde because that's bad. So the one with glasses, oops, no, that doesn't work. The one with a skirt, no, that doesn't work. The one with sandals on, yeah. I think that's ridiculous. Now, if I think that all blondes are airheads and idiots, and I say that all the time, there are blonde jokes out there. And so I say, yeah, the blonde over there. Well, then that's bad. It depends on the trappings you bring with it. My point of view. If prejudice isn't something that's unique to any given culture, it exists in all cultures and it exists in all people. In this country, everybody knows that the Irish are drunkards and that Mexicans are lazy.
And drunks, don't forget that.
Well, they get drunk because they're lazy.
Right.
The Irish are just drunk anyway because they're always drunk and then they get in a fight. And that's why we have paddy wagons.
And then imagine that.
Because everybody's, St. Patty's Day and all these, these dumb micks go out there and they get drunk. These kinds of ideas have existed here and they exist everywhere. So I guess what I'm preaching, if you want to put it that way, is that you shouldn't have the prejudice, but you also shouldn't be afraid of looking at realities and understand that there is no absolute in what we call race or what we call ethnicity or what we call anything like that. I've got a whole nother lecture on the difference between race, ethnicity, national identity, and things like that, because it's a very complicated subject.
Are we gonna ever talk about that cannibalism?
Oh, I'd love to, anytime you want. That one's entitled, You Are Who You Eat. Yes.
Just as a, without the aspect of prejudice, would you say that some people might insist that you're doing away with identity altogether if you're being so general as to, stereotype person based on color without, any kind of bias, prejudice, any kind of...
Well, I mean, bias, prejudice are negative terms. It's not negative for me to acknowledge that my friend here is black and I'm much whiter than he is, but I'm also darker than she is. That's not prejudice. I'm just noticing things. Now, if I say, well, he's dark, but she's blonde, or something I have heard where my wife is Argentine, and there aren't a lot of blacks in Argentina, and I've heard members of the family say things like, well, I've got 2 sons, they're twins, one's darker than the other. And I've heard references like, well, yeah, he's a little bit darker, poor guy. Yeah, I've had a good reaction to that.
Since you singled me out, now,
As the only person who knows who Pele really is, yeah, I had to single you
I
out.
like that picture.
I know, I saw you smile when I put it up.
Now, yellow is not politically correct, brown is not politically correct because the people refer to as yellow, brown said wanted. So why is it a problem for black? Not that I care. I mean, I've never known this until I came to America. I mean,
Yeah.
about black. But so what is the problem if black people say, well, we want to be called, we don't want to be called black, call us African American, because yellow is not politically correct. So it's brown.
What is the problem? And I don't see a problem in anybody coming up with 135 different terms to define themselves. If that's how you see yourself, and to some extent that's how you're seen in society.
Yeah, but you seem to be saying that saying you're not black is wrong.
No, I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm saying if you view the world in terms of black or white, then I think that's wrong because that forces people into categories that come with all these other social trappings, and you may or may not fit in. You're from Africa. I used to play soccer in a Cameroonian team. They were all from Africa, except for there was one non-Cameroonian who was also from some Francophone African country. Because they lived here, they were viewed as African American. They said, but we're not. There are all these cultural trappings that come with it that were not what they were into. One guy had a nightclub, and people would come to his club because it's an African-American nightclub, so he better play hip-hop. But he didn't want to play hip-hop because he wanted to play the African music that he wanted to listen to and his friends wanted to listen to and the people he opened the club for. There are differences in that. And I think those differences are good. And when you say you have to be this or you have to be that, there's a huge problem in South Florida with the Haitian community. First generation tends to hold on very much to their identity as Haitians. Second generation are for the most part pigeonholed as African American, and they tend to deny their Haitian roots, linguistic, cultural, all these different aspects of who they were when they came to the country, to adopt an African American identity. And it becomes very problematic in the households because you have parents who say, we are Haitian. And you've got these kids who want to fit in, and they are given 2 options. They can be black or they can be Oreos. And those are their 2 options. So they're going to go to the one where they don't get beat up every day at school. That's the kind of thing that frankly bothers me. Because they're not that, and they're not that. They're Haitian. It's something different. Let me see. There was a...
Well, I just had trying to iron back to Brazil since it should be I like the quote that we all have some African in us, and that's why I still hold on to the notion that
although I think you put Brazil as a racist country, I still think of it as a very open and liberal country. So is that, I mean, especially when you compare it again to the rest of the sort of bordering countries in South America, like you mentioned Argentina. I mean, I think of Argentina as almost a racist society, and especially you go down along to just number of them. So when you, relative to those countries, I still put Brazil eons ahead.
I wouldn't say eons ahead, it's eons different.
But in the sense that everybody gets along, and there's not.
Do they?
Well, I mean,
If you look at
yeah.
the poorest population of Brazil is 99.9% black by Brazilian standards. And the richest population of Brazil, the top 1%, is 100% white by Brazilian standards white. You know, there are economic disparities, there are educational disparities, and for many decades people did not acknowledge those or address them because they said, well, we live in a racial democracy. So nobody's racist, we all get along because we all have African blood. Culturally, there are African traits. I was going to put in slides of capoeira, you know, carnival, things like that. I was going to put in a little video clip of guys doing, you know, ginga and capoeira and things like that. That's something I've seen. Blonde hair, blue-eyed, 100% Germans from the Colônia who don't even speak any Portuguese, sambando na avenida. Samba, those rhythms come from Africa, it's part of Brazil. And so even though this particular woman grew up with no contact with anybody who doesn't speak German, it was still part of who she was. That's part of Brazil. And I think that's wonderful. But that doesn't excuse the other latent racism that's there.
No, but I mean, the fact that it isn't as obvious, I think is a big step forward.
Yeah, but also, if it's not obvious, then nobody will ever take steps to change it, and it will continue. I mean, that's part of, and that's one of the things that Boyce Davies and others talk about, is the need to raise the awareness of the fact that there is racism there. You know, if I tell a racist joke, it's only racist if it's about a different race than mine. So if I come up here and tell you, you know, I'm Mexican, so let me tell you this joke about this Mexican guy, you know, and I can tell you the joke and it's okay because I'm Mexican. Well, it's okay if I'm Mexican, and especially okay if I'm Mexican and you're all Mexican, and we all agree that this is just something we think is funny, that we all tend to drink too much tequila and get really drunk. You know, and that's why I'm married now. You know, that kind of stuff. Well, it's true. You know, if she's not Mexican, if she tells a joke about these Mexicans drinking too much tequila so they have to get married afterwards, then all the Mexicans say, come on. You know, it's offensive then. But if you're in a society where we all kind of accept that we're all Mexican, and so we'll talk about these stupid, lazy, ignorant Mexicans, but it's okay because we're all Mexican. Is it okay? If that's part of a mechanism that keeps those who are more Mexican in an inferior position compared to those who are less Mexican. You know, there's a joke about the era of segregation in the United States, and there's a school bus, and the kids are fighting because of issues of race and things, and the bus driver gets fed up and he says, that's it, I'm tired of this fighting. Off the bus, everybody, now. And they all get off the bus and look at him and say, that's it, no more fighting. From now, there's no black, there's no white. You're all green, do you understand? Okay, dark green, back of the bus, light green, in the front, now. You know, just because you say they're green and you continue the discrimination, that doesn't mean the discrimination disappeared. And that's kind of what happens in Brazil. We're all a little bit African, and so you people stay here. Ads for jobs, a lot of times, you look in the want ads, and they want somebody who has, you know, a high school diploma, and they have so many years of experience, and they have boas aparências. Good looks, good appearances. Well, boas aparências means you look white. Code words like that. Things like that do exist. Well, it's okay because we're all part African. It's not. If then you don't get the job because you're not as blonde as she is. Not because you're less qualified, but because you're not as blonde as she is, so you don't get the job. But we're not racist because we have racial democracy. That's the problem with that kind of a paradigm. Now, if you want to talk about Argentina, we don't have time.
But the thing is, like, okay, you could say it's the same thing here in the United States, which is, I would say, the leader of the free world for other countries to look as a benchmark. So being the benchmark, yeah, it's not perfect, but it's the best we have right now. So Brazil, being similar to the United States, I would say is pretty up there.
It's similar, but it's different. But what I keep emphasizing is that you can't compare Brazil to Argentina. You can compare, better yet, you can contrast and look at how things are a little bit different. So you can contrast Brazil with Argentina, with the United States, with Peru, with Mexico, but they're all different realities. And the issue I take with people like Robin Sheriff is that I don't think I can take the notions I learned here and impose them upon your culture there. I don't think that's right. You need to be aware of what's going on, and the fundamental issue that what I'm trying to express is that in any culture you're in, you need to be aware of the fact that it's not this or that. I've given essentially this lecture at UCLA, a room this big packed with undergrads, and finished the whole thing, and I think I've gotten the idea across, and then I have somebody who will say, yeah, but that girlfriend of yours, was she black? And I'll say, that's not the point. The point is, in Brazil she's white, and here she's black, because there is no absolute this or that. And if you can't see that there's no absolute, then you don't know what to do with Tiger Woods, and you don't know what to do with any other people who are other. Because we're all other.
Would you say that people who live in the culture, they say like I'm black, so I should, so I'm going to wear whatever kind of clothes and listen to whatever kind of music. Do you think that's a sort of racism?
If I decree, or a society decrees that if you're black, you must wear those clothes and listen to that music, then it's racist. If you say, I like these clothes and I like this music, that's great.
But like seeing that people of a certain race, at least a certain group of them, act a certain way, would that be like racism?
Well, racism is when you, based on your notions of race, create a scale of superiority and inferiority. So if you say, okay, we're black and we know that white men can't jump, like the movie from a few years ago, white men have no rhythm, we're being racist. If I'm Brazilian and I say, well, I'm better in soccer because us Brazilians, we've got ginga, and you white guys, não tem jogo de cintura. That's a very common comment in Brazil. And it's part of the reason Brazil didn't win a World Cup from 1970 until 1994 in Pasadena, because they kept thinking, but we're Brazilians and we've got jogo de cintura, jogo bonito, yeah, we can play. And these guys, these Germans, they don't know how to play, except they won in 74 and they won in, That's racist. I think we're winding down. Okay. I want to thank you all for coming, and if anybody has any more comments or questions, once I take off this microphone, I'll still be here. Thank you very much for coming.